Hi, my name's Ashley Valentine, and I'm here to read Chapter 4 of Moe Brick, and the chapter is called Ugly Mug. Notre Dame wasn't all that bad. It is not the place, but the people that matter. Johnny Mack, the math major who became a legendary charter boat captain, for instance, had helped me find a boat in Cape May that summer. Of course, he was more of an inspiration than anything. I had no idea what I was in for commercial fishing. My rough plan got off to a rough start. I got a ride off the rider board with some guys that were interning in New York City for the summer. I had to make money to survive the school year, so I never even dreamed of interning. It seemed close enough. It's about a 12-hour drive from South Bend, so by the time we got to the Garden State Expressway, it was well past midnight when they dropped me off. Hardly a good time to be hitchhiking. It was cold that night, but eventually I found an old snowplow in the median off the highway that I crawled under to get out of the wind, and I tried to get some sleep. At about 3 a.m. I decided that it was hopeless. I was too cold, so I hit the road. Surprisingly, for that hour I had pretty good luck. Someone brought me down a few exits to where he thought that it would be easier for someone else to pick me up. Then a guy picked me up who said that he did this regularly. He felt that he was giving back to society by giving people rides in the middle of the night. He also introduced me to something I never knew that even existed. Not being a regular hitchhiker at night, he showed me that some trucks had set up projectors on a rig that showed videos on the back of the truck. Then, by tuning in to a designated FM signal, it was possible to watch the videos. Truck companies would use the system to attract drivers, pausing the show and inserting a help wanted ad or whatever. It was kind of neat. We watched the Three Stooges as we drove for about a half hour before he dropped me off. Next, a traveling salesman on his way to Atlantic City picked me up. The mind is an amazing thing, and after doing so much hitchhiking, I was getting good at checking out drivers the instant they came into focus barreling down the highway. As I stood on the on-ramp outside Atlantic City in the cool morning air, as the sun began to rise, I saw Steve Coates coming at me. I recognized him from watching him on TV interviewing my old classmate Kevin Deneen, Coach Poulin, and Bobby Clarke. I gave him a wave and hoped for the best, and to my surprise, he pulled over. "Hey Steve," I said as I got in his car, "long time no see." "Do I know you?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm Moe Brick. You taught me to skate up in Houghton. I thought you recognized me, and that's why you pulled over." He laughed. "Dude, look at you. You're wearing a Flyers jersey, wearing a Michigan Tech Huskies hat, and your backpack has a Canadian flag patch. I think my contract requires me to pick you up." He was on his way to pick up some coffee and donuts for the family. We got caught up over coffee, and I told him that I was headed down to Cape May. He had a side hustle doing home improvement work and made a call and told me that some painters were headed down there and that they would come by and pick me up in a few minutes. He gave me his card and he told me to keep in touch. A few minutes after Coatsy left, a van pulled up. It was about 8 in the morning. When they slid open the side door to let me in, pot smoke rolled out like it was the Scooby-Doo mystery van of my imagination, or the Up in Smoke van from Cheech and Chong, or Spicoli's rig from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. You get the idea. They were on their way to Evelyn's boutique. The boutique was in an old converted stable, and I would later learn was a very famous place. George Washington's horse once slept there. Toad and his buddies were painters. Their van was filled with paint cans and their ladders were on top. The first thing they did was hand me a lit joint. This was going to be an interesting day indeed, I thought. A half hour or so later, we were in the center of Cape May. At the time, the place was primarily known to people from Philadelphia, quote, Bennies, the locals called them, because they benefited the local economy every summer. Cape May had not yet made the national scene for its historic Victorian architecture. In its heyday, the rich and famous had come down from the big cities to enjoy the cool shore breezes during the summer. When they stopped coming, a lot of the big old houses had been allowed to fall into disrepair. But it was still a beautiful little town, even with the rundown homes before the place was fixed up. Evelyn had impeccable style. She knew how to live. Taking her winters in Key West, where she had another shop. She had regular patrons who visited her every year. She kept men's lifestyle magazines and financial papers like the Wall Street Journal out front so that the men would not rush their wives, mistresses, or girlfriends. This was pure genius, as there was always someone outside her shop, which made the place more inviting, which in turn brought in more people. There was always someone interesting hanging around. While the ladies shopped, the guys would talk or read the papers outside. Some guys used to come around just to read the paper, much to their wives' delight. Thinking back on it, though, there may have been a girl watching motive on their part, because not only did Evelyn have beautiful patrons, but she also had a great staff, who were also very stylish. So, quote, "Shop at Evelyn's?" may have been a typical request. "Yes, please," must have been a common response from their male companions. Evelyn was very sweet to me. She let me keep my stuff at her place while I went to the docks to see how the scene worked the first day. When I got back from the docks, she had a case of Canadian beer waiting for me, the painters having told her that I was from Toronto. In exchange, I helped them clean up, and she treated me to a burger at the Ugly Mug, one of the bars on the pedestrian-only town square. Hundreds of customers' mugs hung from the rafters. Basically, work at the docks was day labor. There were 2 main docks in Cape May. Show up early in the morning and unload whatever boats were there. If nothing was going on at one dock, then you head over to the other dock to see what was going on. You could make $100 on a good day, but it was hard work. Most days it was closer to $50 for boxing flatfish that came off the boats. Those boxes were reasonably sized, so other than the continuous motion, there was no real heavy lifting. Basically, the fish would come off the conveyor into a basket on a scale. When the scale tipped a certain weight, the fish would be dumped from the basket into a box with some ice in it. More ice was put on top of the fish, and the box sealed. Then the basket would be put back under the chute, filled to the appropriate weight, and so on. Squid was much more difficult because we put them in totes that must have weighed 100 pounds when full. This would not have been so bad sliding them around on the wet, slimy floor, but they had to be put onto pallets, so they had to be lifted. That would not have been so bad, except we used to stack the bins up head high before the forklift would take the pallets into the freezer. The foreman showed me how to use the weight of the bins to move them. It worked when I was fresh, arcing them up over my head to the top of the pile. But in the afternoon, I would get so worn out that I would have to get someone to help me. Hopefully before the first bin was dropped and the squid spilled out onto the floor. Not a good thing. The dock workers were all pretty friendly, and I remember one black guy in particular. He was a manager and had forearms as big as my thighs. The guy was a gentle giant who did his best to teach me to move around the heavy objects on the dock, like the squid totes and the huge blocks of ice. But the difference in our size made it hard for me to understand what was technique and what was sheer brute force. One of the other workers claimed he was a writer. He used to fish, but was now focused on writing this or that from his little beach house. "Too hard to write while at sea," he used to say. I never did know if he was for real or not, whether he'd ever been published, but he was nice enough. The guy was definitely well read, and we used to talk about some of the books I had read in my literature classes during our lunch breaks. It seemed like we had a couple of black Vietnam vets who had not found their way back into society the first time I met people from that conflict. You could tell they had seen some action in their tour of duties, for unlike my white lawyer friends who I would meet later in life that had also been drafted into the Army and were happy to tell me about guard duty at the embassy in Paris or their practice weekend evacuation drives to Dunkirk, these guys didn't want to talk about it. Then we had a couple of badass 20-somethings. It seemed like they were the guys that Marie had grown up with and left in the dust. They were always talking about their next hit of crank, a homemade amphetamine. Crank got these guys through the monotonous work with energy to spare, but they'd go off the handle for no particular reason, screaming that I was putting too much ice into a box or some weird shit. They offered me some crank one day. No thanks, losers. Evelyn let me stay at her place the first week for free, on the condition that I didn't tell anyone. One morning her landlord showed up for an inspection, and I had to lie perfectly quiet upstairs in the loft until he left. The guy was kind of strange. When I looked down through a crack in the floor, I could see him sniffing the lingerie and rubbing his crotch. It seemed odd to me, but I had no experience in landlord-tenant matters, so I didn't interrupt. Evelyn got a laugh out of that, but told me I'd better find a place soon. She then asked me to help replace a light bulb. "Can you steady the ladder?" she asked. "Sure," I said. She climbed up with her little skirt on. I did my best to resist looking up so that I could maintain her modesty. I really liked this woman and I didn't want to offend her. I could hear her taking out the old bulb, which she had handed to me. Then she put in the new one and the light came on. "How does that look?" she asked. That was how my summer went. I spent the night in one of the abandoned houses near the beach. The next night I hooked up with a girl in one of the old cedar shake mansions closer to the Ugly Mug. The place was the neatest frat house-like place imaginable, right down to the barber's chair in front of the fireplace, used for doing some body shots and pouring liquor down a recliner's throat directly. The girl was a little chubby for me, big and beautiful, my Notre Dame roommate would have said. She had an insatiable sexual appetite. Her stepbrother and stepfather had taken advantage of her proclivity a few years previous when she was still in high school. She told me a little about it, how her stepbrother had started sneaking into her room at night shortly after her mother remarried and the families were reunited. Then her stepdad used to sleep with her when her mother was out of town. Seemed like a sick situation, but what did I know? I was not from the East Coast and had no experience in step parenting. Maybe this was like the landlord-tenant thing at Evelyn's. I began to wonder if Notre Dame was actually giving me the proper lessons to make it in life, as clearly things were different in the real world of New Jersey. I met another girl the next night from the same house. This second girl was incredible, much more to my liking. I felt like I was in heaven when she took off her clothes. This was after 3 years at Notre Dame, where I had hardly had a date, which had created all kinds of feelings of self-doubt and pretty much destroyed my self-esteem in the dating department. Yet I had only been in Cape May for a week and had already met 2 girls, plus Evelyn's crew. I liked Cape May. The house mother wanted people to pay rent, even if they were sharing a room, so I couldn't afford to stay. Too bad. The night after that, I crashed in an abandoned boat laid up on the blocks. I awoke to find a hornet's nest inches from my face and decided it was time to find a proper place to sleep. Soon I got into a rhythm. I slept on the porch of a guy's apartment and put new tubes on an abandoned bike and was able to get to work at the docks easily. After work, I would walk the docks and ask the boats if they needed any crew. Evelyn let me stay at her place the first week for free on the condition that I not tell anyone. One morning, her landlord showed up for an inspection and I had to lie perfectly quiet upstairs in the loft until he left. The guy was kind of strange. When I looked down through a crack in the floor, I could see him sniffing the lingerie and rubbing his crotch. Seemed odd to me, but I had no experience in landlord-tenant matters, so I didn't interrupt. Evelyn got a laugh out of it, but she told me I'd better find a place soon. She then added me to help replace a light bulb. "Can you steady the ladder?" she asked. "Sure," I said. She climbed up with her little skirt on, and I did my best to resist looking up so that I could maintain her modesty. I really liked this woman, and I didn't want to offend her. I could hear her taking out the old bulb, which she handed to me. Then she put in the new one, and the light bulb came on. "How does that look?" she asked. And that's how my summer went. I spent that night in one of the abandoned houses near the beach. The next night I hooked up with a girl in one of the old cedar shake mansions closer to the Ugly Mug. The place was the neatest frat house-like place imaginable, right down to the barber's chair in front of the fireplace, used for doing body shots and pouring liquor down a recliner's throat directly. The girl was a little chubby for me, big and beautiful, my Notre Dame roommate would have said. She had an insatiable sexual appetite. Her stepbrother and stepfather had taken advantage of her proclivity a few years previous when she was still in high school. She told me a little bit about it, how her stepbrother started sneaking into her room at night shortly after her mother remarried and the families were united. Then her stepdad used to sleep with her when her mother was out of town. Seemed like a sick situation, but what did I know? I was not from the East Coast and I had no experience in step parenting. Maybe this was like the landlord-tenant thing at Evelyn's. I began to wonder if Notre Dame was actually giving me the proper lessons to make it in life, as clearly things were different in the real world of New Jersey. I met another girl the next night from the same house. The second girl was incredible, much more to my liking. I felt like I was in heaven when she took off her clothes. This was after 3 years at Notre Dame, where I had hardly had a date, which had created all kinds of feelings of self-doubt and pretty much destroyed my self-esteem in the dating department. Yet I had only been in Cape May for a week, and I had already met 2 girls, plus Evelyn's crew. I liked Cape May. The house mother wanted people to pay rent, even if they were sharing a room, so I couldn't afford to stay. Too bad. The night after that, I crashed in an abandoned boat laid up on blocks. I awoke to find a hornet's nest inches from my face, and I decided that it was time to find a proper place to sleep. Soon I got into a rhythm. I slept on the porch of a guy's apartment and put new tubes on an abandoned bike, and I was able to get to work at the docks easily. After work, I would walk the docks and ask the boats if they needed any crew. I met one of Marie's uncles during this process. Uncle Skip, they called him. Pretty funny to be from a fishing town and have an uncle with that name. I thought I came from a little bit of a maritime tradition, but my seafaring uncle was Jack. One of hers was Skipper. It seemed so classic. One more point in her favor in my mind. I think she thought it was corny. Anyway, Skip was good to me, and he showed me the boat, the Dolphin. The Dolphin was an old wooden Eastern rigged trawler. This meant that the wheelhouse was in the stern. I never saw the Dolphin away from the dock, but that was fine. The Dolphin was not a derelict. She was beautifully painted with a black and green hull. Her spars were all clean, and the wooden interiors felt rich. Uncle Skip told me about the different boats he had worked on and what it was like to work on the sea. Not only did he have a classic name, but the man could spin a yarn. Of course, Uncle Skip had a regular crew. Not that he was fishing regularly anyway, so I kept looking. It was hard getting on as a greenhorn or a first-timer, but I didn't give up. Plus, the eating was good working at the dock. In case it's not obvious by now, I showed up in Cape May with about $20 in my pocket. I had not thought that I might need some cash for a deposit on an apartment, or that it might take some time to find work, but it was my first real summer on my own, so I just had no idea. I did have a check for the balance of my account that I had closed in South Bend, all of about $200. But that was in the day of extended holds on out-of-state checks, so I had no access to cash when I first arrived. Also, since my folks had offered free room and board for the summer back in Toronto, I didn't think I could rightly ask them to send me money, especially not to a place like Cape May, where rent was more than double what it was in South Bend. From the way things were shaping up, not only was I not going to be able to get on a boat and earn lots of money, but I was going to spend a lot of money hanging around a bunch of hot chicks and bennies from Philly. This was probably not something my dad was going to support, so I sucked it up and I did my best to make it on my own. Every meal counted. Fortunately, every day there would be a stray fish or two that had not been boxed. I would throw it into a big bag of ice and I'd take it home for dinner. Squid season was particularly bountiful. We ate squid every imaginable way you could eat it for 2 weeks straight. To this day, I cannot eat squid. I ate so much of it that summer. Within a month, I got onto the Captain Frank and I went to sea for two back-to-back 2-week trips. I've been told that the boat was later used in the movie The Perfect Storm, starring George Clooney. The boat certainly looks similar. Both of my trips aboard the Frank were to the George's Banks, only about a day's steam. They gave me a bunk in the foxhole, or the very, let me do this over, bow. Okay, both of my trips aboard the Frank were to the George's Banks, and only about a day's steam. They gave me a bunk in the foxhole, or the very bow of the ship. Formerly called the forecastle, the foxhole is in the bows of the ship right up front. The bow of any boat is the most tumultuous place to be on a boat. This is one reason why older vessels always had the wheelhouse in the stern, and why the captain's quarters, unlike Uncle Skip's, were usually behind it. It was the smoothest place to be. Imagine the bow of a ship plowing through the water, rising and falling with each wave. After a high crest and deep following trough. Imagine the bow of a ship, you can edit this. Imagine the bow of a ship plowing through the water, rising and falling with each wave. After a high crest and deep following trough, the drop can be precipitous. Indeed, one is best advised to hold on if ever standing on the bow. Now imagine lying down, your head in the direction of the bow. The room is dark because there are no windows, and the small lamp attached to the bunk is only 40 watts, if that. Turn off the lamp and feel yourself rise 10 to 20 feet, then drop again in an instant. You better hang on. Now, try to sleep with a convicted, attempted murderer reading some pornography about 6 feet away from you in the next bunk. Fortunately, after a few days of hard work, the motion becomes second nature. You befriend the ex-con, and you're too tired to care about anything. At least this is what happened to me. Your results may vary. The engineer, John, also slept down there. He had done time for convicted murder. The engineer John also slept down there. He had done time for attempted murder. His victim had received over 100 stitches, mostly to his throat. John had caught his victim with his wife in bed, so he said, after he had come back from a fishing trip early. John's lawyer had successfully convinced the jury that it was a crime of passion, and the judge had taken that into consideration at sentencing. After a brief time in prison, he was now on parole. He was also now my roommate. John was actually a good guy. He was the first to encourage me to go to law school. He said that he trusted me. He thought I would make a good lawyer. Not that he ever showed any kindness or courtesy to me around the rest of the crew, and I was kind of surprised when he told me that over a beer one night. Although we got along, one time he urinated on me while I was cleaning the deck. My back was to him and he wore slickers, so I didn't know what he was doing until he started laughing and I turned around to see him peeing on me. Nice. Another time he offered to buy me a hooker in Atlantic City. I declined. When he and the cook got back, they told me about the 2 hookers they had picked up and fornicated with in some sleazy motel. The cook had asked in mid-stroke if he could put it, quote, in his bitch's ass, as he said. Without hesitation, she turned around at him and said, for $5 more. The boys had a good laugh over that one. Yes, the seafarer's life was quite different from the academic scene at Notre Dame. In addition to the captain, we also had a deck boss of sorts. He was a crusty old guy. He was the owner's friend and was actually pretty good with the winches. I never saw him on the dog pile though. I suspect he was helping the captain find the right fishing grounds, and as he seemed to have had some experience scalloping, unlike the captain. Finally, we had a long-haul trucker. At 25, he had been to every state in the Union. If he could do it, so could I, adding to Kerouac's inspiration for me to hitch out to LA for the Olympics later that summer and kind of recreate the experience from on the road, but without the drugs. The truck driver was also a tough character. He said he used to do a lot of crank, but now he had a family and was serious about making a go of being a commercial fisherman. He had been out to sea before, so he was entitled to a full share. Since it was my first time, I would only get half a share. The share system on every boat is different. On the Captain Frank, we had to pay all the boat's expenses. This included the fuel, the water, the ice, and the food. The idea was that this would always be paid first, up to 1/2 of the trip's income. After that, the rest of the income would be split into shares. A full-fledged crew member was entitled to 1 share. The engineer got an extra half share, and the captain got an extra share. Greenhorns, such as me, only got a half share. A broker trip is when the income does not meet the boat's expenses. Generally, however, the captain gives the crew something, like $100 or so, and lets them stay on the boat while in port, which I did between trips. Since there was lots of food left over in the ice hold, I lived for free. They invited me for a 3rd trip, but I could see there was not going to be any money coming from this boat, so I decided to take what I had made on the docks and head out to the Olympics in LA. It was not the captain's fault. The season had been bad for everyone that year, just especially bad for us because it was the captain's first time looking for scallops. It was not wasted time though. I learned what it was like to work on a commercial fishing boat. On our first trip, we had gone out short-handed. Basically, our shifts, or watches, were 18 hours on and 6 hours off to make up for the lack of a man. Again, every boat has a different watch schedule. On the East Coast, it was either 6 on, 6 off, or 8 on and 8 off. I liked the 8 on and 8 off because I got to experience a full 24-hour day over the course of 2 days. Plus, I could usually get nearly 8 hours of sleep at least every other day. 6 on, 6 off seemed like there was always some sleep deprivation. 18 on and 6 off was very exhausting. In that 6 hours off, you had to eat dinner before going to bed, then breakfast after getting up, plus do whatever else you had to do, and it was just miserable. The captain was seasick the whole first trip, not being used to the motion of his new boat. I got hooked on cigarettes in an attempt to stay awake. I cooked between hauls at the meal times. The second trip, we had a full complement. I got pretty good at shucking and bagging, mostly because we caught more scallops. I also ate a lot of fresh scallops, which again, I can no longer eat. I ate so many of them that summer. We had 8 hours on and 8 hours off, and I got lots of sleep. At the end of the summer, I gained over 20 pounds of muscle and had grown over an inch, almost coatsy sized. My hands also grew and got very strong, very strong. I'll never forget when my father introduced me to one of his college buddies my freshman year. His big miner's hand had wrapped around mine and squeezed the bones together painfully. When I met him again over Thanksgiving break after working at sea, I again shook his hand. Not forgetting what he had done to me, I reveled in my ability to rub the bones off of his palm together. He was a tough old guy who wouldn't wince, but I could tell from his eyes that we now had a little understanding as to what constituted a firm handshake. I worked the deck during scallop trips. In addition to a scallop knife, our gear consisted of black rubber boots, white for the southern boats, an orange slicker, usually just the bottoms, and rubberized synthetic gloves. To my mother's distress, we did not wear life jackets to keep us afloat in case we fell overboard or use jack lines to keep us on board. It took about a day to get out of the fishing grounds. Once there, basically, the captain finds a spot on the chart that he thinks will be good. This will be the age of Loran. Okay. This will be the age of Loran, before GPS. So this was an inexact science, but close enough for what we had to do. The winch operator would then lift up one of the dredges from the deck and hang it on the back of the boat. The dredges were attached to long, thick cables attached to winches bolted to the deck below the wheelhouse on forward part of the deck. My job was to stand next to one of the dredges on the stem with a small sledgehammer. On the skipper's signal, I would hammer out a pin in the goose eye clamp. The pin was made of solid steel in the shape of a wedge about 6 inches long. I would then run to the other side of the boat and do the same with that dredge. The dredges weigh over a ton, and the force of the water on the bag creates a lot of drag, so the clamp releases with a lot of force, and the pin can swing pretty fast at one's head as it springs back on its leash. I never got hit with it, but it seemed like a good way to lose an eye. We would then tidy up the deck and wait for the captain to finish his run. He had a plotter in the wheelhouse, which helped him keep track of where he was. He would steam slowly, maybe 5 knots for half an hour or so, and then haul the dredges back up. I would then attach a cable with a hook from a boom to the dredge as it came alongside, and the dredge would be lifted aboard. Then I would help get the second dredge aboard. With both aboard, I would then attach the hooks to the bottom of the first bag. Each bag would be lifted and its contents dropped onto the deck. We would then get the dredges set for the next haul. If the captain was going to fish right away, we got them out first before clearing the deck. Otherwise, we just got the dredges to the stern and then we cleared the deck. We fished most of the time. We were constantly at work. As soon as the deck was cleared and the scallops bagged, we would haul up the dredge and do it all again. Clearing the deck of a scallop boat is a decidedly unpleasant experience. The bottom of the George's bank is littered with garbage. Anything of value is picked up off what we call the dog pile and thrown into a tote bin. By value, I mean scallops. It's like looking for coins in a long pile of manure. The pile is as long as the dredge is wide and could have been a foot or more tall depending on what we were dragging through on the bottom. It is back-breaking work. The work position is bent over the pile like a dog, the arms working like a dog's front paws digging a hole in the ground. Bent over like a dog for hours and hours, the lower back pain can become excruciating. Scallops that are too small, generally less than the width of my palm, were thrown back. Large monkfish, an ugly fish with a wide mouth full of sharp teeth, are also kept over a certain size. They are headed and gutted. The tails have a similar texture as lobster. Often they're used to fill in lobster dishes. I liked them on their own. They were a nice lean white meat. They didn't have much of a market value at the time, so we weren't happy to see them when they came aboard, but they were still worth something. Everything else is shoveled into the scuppers, holes in the side of the boat to let water drain off the deck, but large enough to shovel out this crap. Some garbage was always in the pile. A lot of sand dollars, crabs, skates. I can't remember it all, just that it was all soaking wet and heavy and sometimes used to smell. The work sucked. This is not what I imagined commercial fishing to be about. Never once did I get to drive the boat or operate any of the winches or other machinery, and it was terrible. The only cerebral thing I gained was how to operate and read the weather charts that were generated several times a day. With the deck cleaned and ready for the next haul, the bins are brought to the back of the boat where the scallops are shucked in a little shed built above the lazarette. With the deck cleaned and ready for the next haul, the bins are brought to the back of the boat where the scallops are shucked in a little shed built above the lazarette, which is kind of a hold in the very back of the boat. A special curved shucking knife is used to cut away the mussel from the shell. The guts are then scraped over the stern and the muscles scraped into a bucket. The shells follow the guts overboard. John was excellent at this job. Sometimes it was like looking at a snow flurry of guts and shells flying off of his knife. The contents of the bucket were then put into the cheesecloth bags and tied with a metal clasp. Being careful to keep the bags clean, they were then put into the totes, lowered into the hole, and iced. It's an endless job. Eating is only possible while dragging, so each meal is necessarily short, unless we were steaming to another fishing ground. But even when steaming, there's always something to do. Ice needs to be moved around in the hole. The deck can always use cleaning. Sometimes navigation lights in the rigging needed to be changed or pulleys greased. Then there are the endless repairs. Bilge pumps. Bilge pumps get clogged and have to be cleaned. The engine may have issues. Water can get into the fuel line. When there's nothing to do, the captain and crew make things up for the greenhorn to do. The first one they tried to get me, the first one they tried was to get me to climb back up the rigging after I'd changed some navigation lights on the night before and stand on a spar looking for the mailboat. Of course, I was a little too savvy for this snipe hunt. After all, I collected stamps. My Uncle Jack, a former sea captain in the Canadian Navy, had taught me all about stamps and how the post office works. He had never said anything about getting mail while he was at sea. Indeed, being from the Detroit area and interested in all things maritime, I happen to know that the only marine post office is on the Detroit River. Here the river is so narrow and calm that the mailboat is able to pull right up next to the big freighters who drop a bucket on a rope down to retrieve the mail. The crew was not fooling me. I knew there was no mail service way out here. I'd had enough of being tossed into the foxhole and having a knife held to my neck. I was not going to climb the rigging again just to look for the mailboat, but I would climb the rigging to get some fresh air and give myself a break from them, so whenever they asked me to go, I would oblige. The job never stops, even if the weather is tough. One of my favorite things to watch in weather was how close the waves would come to the outriggers. The derrick-like structures look like towers when the boat is in port, but after clearing the breakwater, they are lowered parallel to the water. They extend out to perhaps half the length of the boat. The ends are perhaps 10 feet over the water, from which steel fins or birds are hung by chains, another 10 feet into the water to slow the boat's roll. The birds provide resistance as the outrigger rises with each roll, stabilizing the boat. I never saw one pop out of the water, but I saw them come close many times. Sometimes I would imagine windsurfing in such conditions, the clean, uninterrupted wind filling my sail as I skimmed down the wave faces over 100 miles from shore. It was so peaceful when we were out there. The only interruption would be the nightly sonic boom of the Concorde as she flew into New York. Dawn was my favorite time, though. After a long night where one's universe was confined to the area illuminated by the deck lights and the winkling of the other lights in the waves, it was neat to see the dawn reveal that the tiny lights were actually attached to other fishing boats who were doing the same thing that we were doing. After 2 weeks of non-stop work, we would finally turn for port. The idea is to head back when the hole is full. Hopefully the market price is good, which can result in an early return even if there is room for more fish in the hole. In our case, we were simply running low on fuel and food, so we went back when we had to do so, not because we had caught enough. Once back on shore, you realized how difficult it was to work at sea. For the past 2 weeks, everyone else had been working regular hours and partying at night. New people had moved into town. Things had happened in the news that were unusual or tragic or different. Sometimes you wondered if the world would end while you were out there and you would never even know about it, only to return to port with a hole filled with rotting fish. But that never happened. You just partied for the first few days, then got ready for the next trip. All the while hoping that you could squeeze a normal life in while you were in port and that your friends would still be there when you returned. This didn't always happen. John was an example of things not going well while he was at sea. One morning, John asked me to fry a dozen eggs for him sunny side up. Quote, "If you break a yolk, I will cut your heart out," he said while drawing out a knife. He could be a mean son of a bitch. Of course, I broke several yolks in the pitching kitchen. When he saw his plate, he stood up and said, "Let's fight, put 'em up." Whatever. I got up and I put 'em up like Bobby Clarke, bobbing my head around like Angie had taught me. John was a street fighter and an attempted murderer who had spent time in the state penitentiary. He knew when someone could handle himself. He reached for his knife, which was something new to me. Fortunately, he put it on the table and started laughing. "I'm just fucking with you, man," he said. We sat down and ate, and I told him about Bobby Clarke. John was a huge Flyers fan and tuned into Coatsy regularly, thank God. We worked 8 hours on and 8 hours off. For an entire summer, that was my routine, and something pretty unusual happened. First off, I started to grow. Every time I came into port, I had to buy new pants. By the end of the summer, I could no longer fit into my small size t-shirts, and I had to buy mediums. Also, I commenced to grow out. By the time I got back to school, I was a massive 5'7" and weighed 180 pounds of pure muscle. I know not massive, but for a guy who'd always been the littlest guy on the ice, it was pretty impressive to have a body mass index of 28. No one could believe it. Coach felt bad because now I was finally big enough to play in the NCAA, but varsity hockey at Notre Dame was dead thanks to Title, what is it, 10, 9? 9? Or 4? What time am I? 9. Okay. Coach felt bad because now I was finally big enough to play in the NCAA, but varsity hockey at Notre Dame was dead thanks to Title IX to make way for equity with women's sports. Anyway, with my small settlement in my pocket, I hit the road and started hitchhiking out to LA for the Olympics. I met several other good highway Samaritans who gave me some good road trips. One even put me up for the night. In Colorado, I crashed at a rest stop and was woken up about 24 deer running past me, inches from my head. I spent an all-nighter in Vegas, and I managed to break even and stayed supplied with the free drinks in a time when they still did that. Some AWOL Marines brought me as far as East LA when a friend picked me up and brought me to his house. He showed me around and brought me to some of the Olympic venues, including Long Beach, where the windsurfing competition was being held. Then I started hitching north to San Francisco to see another friend. Along the way, Ron Jeremy picked me up in a black 3 Series BMW. I had no idea who he was and was not interested in his offer to shoot a porn scene with his crew in the valley. He dropped me off between exits, which did not seem very cool, but eventually I made it to San Francisco. My friend lived next door to Nina Hartley, and when I told him about my experience, he introduced me to her. She had nothing but sweet words for Ron and sympathy for me. I asked her if she knew anyone with a boat, and she hooked me up with a guy sailing to Hawaii. 10 days later, I was in Honolulu. I checked out the law school there to justify the trip, but was a little desperate to get back to school. Thank God for understanding parents, and my dad got me a flight back to San Francisco. I probably should have flown back to Chicago to get back to school on time, but if I was going to go to law school, as John had advised, I needed to check out a school in Portland and swing by the Gorge, which had some of the best windsurfing in the world. My buddy dropped me off on the north end of the Golden Gate, and I started hitching north. That evening in Humboldt County, a Humboldt State marine biology student and former fry cook picked me up. This guy had the best weed. Anyway, I told him about Moe and how much I had learned sitting in the tidal pool. Then I said at night we used to sing in the men's house. A little buzzed, it seemed appropriate to sing, and I taught him the words of one that stuck in my head. There once was some plankton that lived in a beer can under the sea. They drank beer in tuba whenever they wanted. So if you want to get drunk all the time, hey ho, hey ho. Then drop on the deck, flop like a fish, Lanya, Lanya, hey ho, hey ho. He thought that was pretty funny and thought it had potential. Years later, the fine folks at Nickelodeon would introduce the world to the world's greatest fry cook, SpongeBob and Moe's tidal pool. The next day, I made it up to Portland, and I saw the law school. Then I caught a $99 cross-country bus fare that brought me through the Columbia Gorge. The gorge was amazing, more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen in my travels. Plus, true to form, it was windy for what seemed like 100 miles, with dozens of windsurfers sailing in the challenging conditions. A few days later, I was back in South Bend and got back to school only a couple days late for class. Thank you for allowing me to read Chapter 4 of Moe Brick for you. Good night.